the work that I'll be presenting here is ongoing research, and there comes another thank you to Gunvald and his team, is a collaboration that we've been doing together with the Bertelsmann Foundation. And it is about specifically examining how skills develop. So also, again, thanks to Casper for sharing a lot of details. That there's a lot of explaining that I now do not have to do anymore, because you already talked a bit about time series analysis and all these things, the difficulties and tricks that come with it. And we'll be specifically looking at skills, because the research that my team and I are doing at the University of Oxford is around preparing people for the future of work. And this obviously, as you can imagine, relates to skills as on the company and employer level. Casper has already pointed out. But what is the situation that we're in? So the situation that we're in is often painted in rather grim colors. When we think about the future of work, people imagine a workplace where the robots and the artificial intelligence algorithms, where ChatGPT is taking over, and we have nothing left to do but the very trivial task of maybe mopping the floor, because even the robots don't want to do these jobs. And you're probably all familiar with various publications and reviews. Whenever a new advancement in AI comes up, like ChatGPT, like large language models, pretty quickly the fear of mass unemployment sparks. And people get increasingly worried that technology might replace them on the labor market. On the other hand, there are also other stories where people, particularly folks that are working as data analysts or data scientists, are doing pretty well. And they're doing pretty well, not despite, but because of advancements in technology, because of artificial intelligence. So they're running with the machines, to quote our colleagues, Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee from MIT. They're running with the machines. They're using AI technologies. They're using new technologies, not only in the field of AI, but also in the field of graphic design or audio or video design, for example, to get very profitable and interesting jobs on the labor market. So how can these both stories, how can we unite these two both stories? Well, actually, they're both true to a certain extent, because economists say that that technological change does not affect all skills equally. There's an economic terminology for this called the non-neutrality of technological change. So technological change favors some technologies, some skills of knowing how to work with programming languages, with computers, but it also automates, it also makes certain other skills redundant. So if we think of very repetitive tasks that can easily be done electronically, like entering data into a spreadsheet, for example, are now increasingly done by machines. So if both of these stories are true, though, we find ourselves in a difficult situation, because we find ourselves in a paradoxical situation that some old skills disappear and some new skills emerge. And so we might have an oversupply and overdemand on the labor market. And this is often known or often labeled as the so-called skill gap. So a mismatch between what firms are demanding and what the workforce actually has in supply in terms of skills. And we see this here on the right-hand side, the so-called Beveridge curve, which compares the vacancy rate on the vertical axis and the employment rates on the horizontal axis. And we see a shift on the same level of vacancies with higher unemployment during the financial crisis, the first financial crisis, a lot of layoffs, of course. And then interestingly, we see a shift backwards. So we're at the same levels where we were in 2008 in terms of unemployment rates, but now vacancy rates keep on getting up. And this is for the European 28. EU 28. And this picture looks much more severe if you look at specific sectors, like the ICT sector, for example. So there are sectors which are much more affected by actually the phenomenon of the skill match, where, for example, half of the ICT departments in big companies in the European Union recently reported that they are lacking crucial talent. So there are more jobs than could be filled. So the dystopian picture of the future where the machines are taking over has not materialized yet. And then again, apart from this, Casper already told us something about the unpredictability. There's some unpredictable events. There's some external events, some external shocks. And one of them is, for example, the twin transition. The twin transition is described in the policy field as a phenomenon that is combining two developments. One is one that we briefly touched upon already, and that is the emergence of technologies, demand for blue skills, so blue skills, digital skills. So the European Commission, for example, estimates that by the end of this decade, there'll be approximately 2.5 trillion euros in the added to the GDP just because of the usage of new skills, of new skills related to digital technologies. And then, on the other hand, there are ambitious plans, obviously, to make our economy green, to make our economy more sustainable. So the European Green Deal, for example, which has very ambitious targets, but these targets, they are not only reflected in factories where CO2 emissions need to be reduced and things need to be run more effectively, but of course, they have obvious repercussions on the labor market. Because if you think of a technology like carbon capture, for example, which is more or less brand new, at least in the industrial scale that we're probably looking at it in the future, you need people to work to develop these technologies. You need people who have skills that are adapted for this change. And this puts a lot of pressure, in addition to the phenomena that I mentioned, the technological change on the labor market. And so I think there's an interesting quote by the futurist Alvin Toffler, who said, like, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So we come to the point that we all need to learn new skills. I think the examples that I just mentioned make this pretty obvious to us. But the question is, if the future of work is really about learning new skills, which are those skills that we need to invest in? So if you only think of one domain that is often the acclaimed champion of reskilling, which is learning a programming language, learning coding languages, for those of you who are familiar with programming languages, you know this is a universe. There's a universe of programming languages. There's so many programming languages that if you tell somebody who has never encountered a programming language, the person quickly might get lost and ask you, like, okay, but what is it? Should I learn SQL or Perl or R or Python? Because everybody says Python is the big programming language. I mean, Caspar already showed us that the trend might continue on Python. You know, Python might stay popular and increase in popularity, but maybe the same thing happens like it happened to Perl, and all of a sudden people are shifting to a new programming language. And that was one of the motivations why we wanted to look at the development of skills and how to maybe forecast this development with the example of the twin transition. So just a small note on the data. We're looking about roughly 2 million job vacancies between 2016 and 2022 from Germany in various industries like the logistics industry, like the healthcare sector, for example, or building sector. And we're looking at 3 different aspects. These aspects, or these metrics, they reflect different aspects about these skills. So they reflect different things that might matter for this skill now, and then, if we want to project it, also in the future. We heard one example from Caspar already. That's the frequency. That's how often, in relative terms. So if I just pick a job announcement, 100 job announcements randomly from the field of building, construction work, for example, how often does the skill renovation work, how often is this skill required in this set? That's the frequency. Then we have a metric which we describe as centrality, and that's kind of the systemic relevance of a specific skill. And that kind of tells us, okay, and that's also something that we heard, skills are not used in isolation. Skills are always combined with other skills. There are some path dependencies. So if you want to do machine learning, for example, if you want to teach algorithms how to recognize images, for example, you need to know a programming language. There's no way around this, right? There's a path dependency. You need to know, for example, Python in order to do machine learning. So one skill requires the next. And if you take this to a larger scale, the whole network emerges of skills that are connected. And the centrality of a specific skill tells us something. How systemically relevant is this skill in this network of other skills? And last but not least, something that we're trying to squeeze out here, and that's the premium. That's the economic value of a skill. So if I add this specific skill to my skill portfolio, if I manage to have this skill, how much more could I earn? To what other jobs with a higher wage level could I apply if I have this specific skill? I tell you already, it gets difficult to squeeze this last one out with German data for one simple reason. German people do not like to talk about how much they earn. German people do not like to talk about how, the price tag of a specific job. That's a completely different picture in the United States, as some of you might imagine, and also in the UK. So the data is just very sparse. There are not a lot of vacancies, relatively speaking, that have this price information, but I'll get to this at a bit. Let's have a quick look. I'm rushing to this one a little bit because Caspar already gave a great introduction on this, on what we need to do this time series analysis, on how to say something from past data about future. One thing is we want to find these elements that Caspar already spoke about, seasonality, cyclicality, and trend, because only if we find those, we can actually make predictions. We've just seen this. And then the question is, how much to the future can we actually extrapolate? So can we be certain about saying something? Like the example from Perl and Python showed us that we should be really careful about this. And how reliable are these predictions? So can we put them to test, essentially? And we've been trying to do this with some of the skills that we are looking at here. And this is work in progress, basically. For example, air condition technology. So this is one of the skills that is in an advertisement, in a green job advertisement. Typically, those are people that are required, or a person would be required to work with air conditioning technologies. And what we see here is a pattern. So is the share of the frequency, how often this specific skill is being demanded in a certain set of jobs, in a specific field of jobs. And one thing that we see is clearly something like seasonality. So at least to my eye, there is kind of a pattern where we see that in specific times of the year, particularly when it's hot, we need more climate tech skills than in other times of the year. And there's also some kind of cyclicality here in the sense that there are certain summers that are much hotter than others. So, for example, those here, they've been where temperatures were significantly above the average of this time span, and apparently also, quite logically, the demand for air condition is increasing, and so also the demand for people working with these technologies, having the skills to work with these technologies, increases. Let's have a look at the trend. This is an example on the left-hand side of another green skill, and that's renovation skill. So a skill that is actually thought to be in high demand. But what we see in our data, interestingly, and that's something for debate, maybe also later on, is that apparently there is a trend, but it's not going in the direction that we would have expected. So for renovation work in building and construction, the field of construction at least, we see a tendency of a declining share. So less and less job vacancies are actually demanding this skill. And what we see here in green is already getting to the interesting part. It's getting to the interesting part, which is trying to forecast. So the time series ends here, and we're trying to forecast for a roughly speaking 12 month in this case. And the funnel that we see around this dotted line is the so-called confidence interval. So for those of you who are not familiar with time series analysis or with statistical analysis, that's kind of a certainty interval. So this is telling us how certain can we be about what we're predicting here. And you see that obviously, the further we like to look in the future, the wider the funnel gets, the more uncertain, the more unreliable, or the more likely it will be that our predictions might be off, actually. We're seeing a similar pattern for the other metric that I mentioned earlier, and that's the centrality. Centrality, again, means if I look at all the skills that are demanded in this specific type of job, how central? Where is renovation work placed in this network? And we have a closer look at this in a bit, how this really looks like. But just to show you a different example with a different development, this is a blue skill. This is Python. This is the programming language that we already had a look at. And so you might think that Caspar and we've been doing some prepping here together, but no, it's more or less just by coincidence. But it probably speaks for the fact that Python is really it's really on everybody's mind right now when we think about blue skills, about digital skills, because it's such a powerful programming language, and our data speaks the same language. So both on the left-hand side in terms of frequency, but also on the right-hand side in terms of systemic relevance, Python is on the rise. There's a clear trend There are some hiccups in the data, which still are puzzling us to a certain extent. But overall, the pattern is pretty clear. You could put a straight line into this. And also accordingly, our predictions, our 12-month predictions shows a similar trend. It is very unlikely, if you look at the confidence interval, for example, that Python is going to fall below the values where it is or where it had been currently when we started the prediction in early 2023. So how does this look like in practice, this systemic relevance, this network relevance? Here's an example. Please excuse me, this is in German. We did not recreate the network in English, but I'm happy to guide you through. So we, for example, see that here we have Bausanierung, which is renovation essentially. And what we see is that Bausanierung is connected to other skills that are relevant in the field of renovation work or of building work. So, for example, we see architecture here, or we see Baugruben, which is essentially, creating the ditches for building a new building. And the numbers here show us how Bausanierung, how renovation work is connected to these other skills. So how frequently they're mentioned together in a job posting. So in this sample, in 24 times of the vacancies, Bausanierung has been mentioned together with Baugruben for, well, more or less obvious reasons. If you're building something, you're probably also working with renovation. But this has been data from 2017 to 2019. Now let's look at the more recent time interval, and we see that Bausanierung has not really shifted that much. It's still more or less in the periphery of this network, and it also hasn't really intensified its connections to other skills. So it's more or less, in terms of its systemic positioning, still at the same level. What do I mean with this? Well, let's have a look at this.
Talking about time, there's 3 minutes left.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Because we see a completely different picture here with Python. And Python has certainly changed its positioning in the network. 2017 to 2019, Python is somewhere in the periphery of this coding network. So this is a network of job vacancies in the field of app development, for example. And we see it's pretty far away from the actual core where app development here is done. It's loosely connected by other programming languages, but it's really at the margin. It's also not very strongly connected. Just like a few dozen of postings mention Python together with Linux and the programming language C and Java. But the picture had completely changed in 2020 to 2022. Python has shifted towards the center of this network. By the way, also getting closer to a skill that is very valuable, which is app development. For obvious reasons, app development is valuable because we're using apps every single day. And it had also intensified its connections to these other skills. So these connections are 5 to 6 times stronger than it had been before. So Python has become more systemic in this network. And what does this mean for the premium? To get our last metric and concluding here, look at the left and the middle chart. This is renovation work in Python. What we looked at here is the premium. So I said to you, Germans don't really like to talk about their wages. Sometimes they do. And we try to make a distinction here between the postings that speak about renovation, that mention renovation, say like, hey, renovation work skills are needed in this posting, and those that don't. And similarly for Python. And as we look at those that do, which is the black bar, we see that there's an upwards trend for renovation for both. There's an upwards trend here for both the vacancies that mention renovation and also those that do not mention renovation. While for Python, the picture looks pretty different. For Python, before, in 2018 to 2020, the premium has been more or less negative. So the vacancies mentioning Pythons had lower wages on average than those that did not mention Python in the same domain, so for the same type of work. And this picture has completely changed. Now, the vacancies mentioning Python have, on average, a significantly higher wage offering than those that don't. So the premium has turned from negative to positive. And we think that this is clearly related also to what I showed you earlier, namely that Python has not only increased in frequency, but also in systemic relevance in the network of skills. So very shortly speaking, we find all these factors and we manage to explain and to extrapolate. And I'll use the last, if I'm not miscalculating, few seconds, Kai, to just briefly advertise for another project that we are doing in Oxford, where we look at skills not only in isolation, but also with regard to what people already know. Because if you think about all these trends that I mentioned at the beginning, all these technological trends, the green shift, the blue shift, the twin transition, people are not learning things from scratch. They already have skills, and particularly if they have been spending times 20 and maybe 30 years on the labor market already. So they're not adding skills on a blank page, but they're adding skills to an existing skill portfolio, to skills that they already have. And so the question of complementarities arises. There's certain complementarities, certain skills are more valuable if you combine them with one skill set than combining them with another skill set. And that's what we're looking at in the Scale project. To make it very short, find our research under the QR code or under the webpage, or just pop me a message by email or Twitter or LinkedIn. Thanks so much.